in the winter of 1888 in a laboratory annex at Edison's Menlo Park complex in New Jersey. A self-styled electrical engineer named Harold P. Brown was strapping stray dogs to a wooden platform and running high-voltage alternating current through their bodies while reporters watched. Thomas Edison did not pull the switch himself, but he had given Brown the space, the equipment, and according to surviving correspondence and later court testimony, quiet financial backing to prove a single commercial point that alternating current, the system championed by his rival George Westinghouse, was a killer, and that Edison's own direct current was safe. The question this story has to answer is not whether Edison invented things. He held 1,093 patents and ran the most famous laboratory in America, but whether the man mythologized as the lone genius of the light bulb was, just as often, something closer to a brilliant impresario of other people's work, willing to bend evidence, starve credit, and destroy rivals to keep his name on the marquee. To understand why Edison needed to win so badly, you have to understand what kind of man he already was by 1878, when he opened his invention factory at Menlo Park. He was 31, half-deaf since childhood, from what he later attributed to a train accident or a beating by a conductor. Accounts he told differently at different times, and he had already made a fortune and a reputation by selling improvements on other people's telegraph systems to Western Union and to the financier Jay Gould. The quadruplex telegraph of 1874, which let 4 messages travel one wire at once, was Edison's, but it built directly on stock ticker and duplex telegraph work by others, and Edison sold the rights in a bidding war between Western Union and Gould that made him rich and taught him an enduring lesson. Patents were not just tools, they were weapons, and the man who controlled the paperwork controlled the profit, regardless of who actually had the idea first. At Menlo Park, Edison built something almost no one had built before, a dedicated industrial research laboratory staffed with machinists, chemists, and mathematicians whose sole job was to turn raw curiosity into patentable products. This is the fact modern hagiography gets backwards. Edison's real innovation was organizational, not personal. He assembled men like the mathematician and physicist Francis Upton, fresh from Princeton and from study under Hermann von Helmholtz in Germany, to do the calculations Edison himself could not do. Charles Batchelor, a skilled English machinist, to build and refine what Edison sketched, and a glassblower named Ludwig Bohm, trained by the German scientific instrument maker Heinrich Geissler, to make the vacuum bulbs. Edison called his employees muckers, a term of rough affection, and he worked them brutally, often through the night, sustained by naps on lab benches and an atmosphere Edison cultivated deliberately. Cigars, practical jokes, communal meals, and the promise that this was a family enterprise, all pulling for the boss. It worked for a while because Edison was genuinely inspiring to be around, restless, funny, contemptuous of formal theory, obsessed with results. But the family metaphor concealed a harder truth. The patents that came out of that building went out under one name. The incandescent light bulb is the clearest case study in how that system operated, and it is worth being precise about what Edison actually did, because the popular story, solitary genius invents electric light in a flash of inspiration, collapses almost immediately under examination. By 1878, when Edison announced he was working on electric lighting, at least 20 other inventors in Britain, France, and the United States had already built working incandescent lamps, including Joseph Swan in England, who had demonstrated a carbon filament bulb as early as 1860 and again improved in 1878 and 1879, and Moses Farmer and William Sawyer in the United States. None of these bulbs lasted long enough or drew little enough current to be commercially useful, and that, not the basic principle of incandescence, was the real unsolved problem. So what then did Edison actually contribute? Edison's genius, and it was real, lay in reframing the challenge as a systems problem. He understood partly through Upton's calculations of resistance and partly through his own commercial instinct that a workable electric light needed a high-resistance filament combined with a very low-current parallel circuit, or the economics of copper wiring alone would make citywide lighting impossible. That insight, more than any single filament, is Edison's most defensible claim to originality in the story. Getting there took the whole lab, and it took months of exhausting, repetitive failure that Edison later mythologized as heroic persistence, rather than admitting how collaborative it had been. Batchelor and a chemist named Martin Force tested thousands of filament materials, platinum, various carbons, boron, even a hair from an assistant's beard, according to lab notebooks, before the team settled in October 1879 on a carbonized cotton thread that burned for roughly 13 to 14 hours in a vacuum bulb Bohm had built using techniques adapted from the German scientist Hermann Sprengel's vacuum pump. Edison did not personally discover this filament in an isolated eureka moment. The lab notebooks preserved today at the Thomas Edison Papers Project at Rutgers show a team cycling through candidates under Edison's direction, with Edison contributing crucial judgment about what to test next, but rarely doing the tedious testing himself. When the press reported the breakthrough, however, the story that went out, cultivated by Edison's own statements to reporters, was of the Wizard of Menlo Park, a nickname a New York Sun reporter had coined the year before, single-handedly conquering electric light through midnight vigils and sheer will. That myth had consequences that outlasted the bulb itself. Joseph Swan in Britain held a patent that predated much of Edison's American filing, and rather than fight it out fully in court, Edison's British company merged with Swan's in 1883 to form the Edison and Swan United Electric Light Company, a settlement that quietly conceded Swan had a legitimate priority claim Edison's public narrative never acknowledged. In the United States, Edison's own company spent years in litigation with Sawyer and Mann over overlapping patents. And while Edison's side eventually prevailed in the courts in 1892, legal historians studying the case have noted the outcome turned as much on the depth of Edison's legal war chest as on any unambiguous clarity about who had truly been first. Edison did not invent the light bulb from nothing. He and the team he assembled and directed made the first version of it good enough, cheap enough, and safe enough to sell, and then he made sure the world believed he had done it alone. The most damning window into Edison's character, though, is not the bulb, but the man he brought into his lab in 1884, and then, within a year, drove into bitter rivalry: Nikola Tesla. Tesla arrived in New York with a letter of introduction from Charles Batchelor, who had worked with him in Europe, describing him as one of two great men he had known, the other being Edison himself. Tesla later recalled, in an account written decades afterward for a 1919 magazine memoir, and therefore treated by historians with some caution, that Edison promised him $50,000 if he could redesign the inefficient DC dynamos used in Edison's power plants. Tesla says he did the work, was told the offer had been an American joke, and was offered a $10 a week raise instead. Whether the $50,000 figure is literally accurate or an embellishment from an old man's grudge, the underlying pattern is not in dispute. Tesla did substantial engineering work for Edison's company, was paid modestly, and left within a year, disillusioned, to strike out on his own, eventually into the arms of George Westinghouse, the one man capable of turning Tesla's alternating current patents into Edison's greatest commercial nightmare. That nightmare had a name in the trade press by the late 1880s, the War of Currents, and it revealed Edison at his most ruthless and most personally exposed. Direct current Edison's system could not be transmitted efficiently over long distances without enormous, expensive copper wiring, which meant DC power plants had to be built every mile or so through a city, profitable for the companies selling the plants, but limiting for citywide expansion. Alternating current, using transformers based substantially on Tesla's patents licensed to Westinghouse, could travel miles at high voltage and be stepped down for household use far more cheaply. Edison understood the technical case for AC's superiority. His own engineers, including a young researcher named Arthur Kennelly, had reported on its advantages internally. But conceding that would have meant conceding the obsolescence of the entire DC infrastructure Edison had already sold to cities across the country. And Edison chose instead to fight the argument on the ground of fear rather than economics. This is where Harold Brown enters, and where the story stops being about clever patents and becomes something darker. Brown was not an Edison employee in any formal salaried sense. Company records are murky, and Edison's defenders have long pointed to that ambiguity. But the documentary record, including letters Brown himself wrote and receipts later uncovered by historians, shows he received laboratory space, equipment, and covert cash support from Edison's organization to run a public campaign proving alternating current was inherently deadly. This is the fully documented answer to how Edison scammed his way to the top, not merely by claiming other people's inventions as his own, but by secretly bankrolling a fear campaign to kill a superior rival technology once his own investments were threatened. Brown staged demonstrations in 1888 and after, electrocuting dogs, calves, and eventually a full-grown horse with Westinghouse-style AC generators in front of journalists and scientific societies to popularize a new verb that briefly entered the American vocabulary, to be Westinghoused. Edison, for his part, gave interviews insisting he had no personal animus toward Westinghouse and no financial interest in Brown's crusade. Statements that sit uneasily against the paper trail showing his lab's material support for exactly that crusade. Predicted CTA Sentence 01. The campaign reached its grimmest expression in the invention of the electric chair. New York State, seeking a more humane method of execution than hanging, consulted Brown and through him, effectively Edison, on what current should be used. Edison, who publicly opposed capital punishment on record, nonetheless steered the state toward adopting alternating current for the chair, not by his own later account, because he wanted to endorse executions, but because associating AC with death by law would brand Westinghouse's technology in the public mind more effectively than any dog demonstration could. When William Kemmler became the first person executed by electric chair, on August 6, 1890, in Auburn Prison, New York, the execution used a Westinghouse-manufactured dynamo that Edison's allies had gone to considerable lengths to obtain secretly, since Westinghouse himself refused to sell equipment for the purpose and reportedly called the chair the culmination of a series of blunders. The execution was reportedly botched, requiring a second, longer application of current, an outcome the press seized on, and one that briefly seemed like it might vindicate Edison's smear campaign rather than expose its cruelty. None of it saved direct current. By 1893, Westinghouse had won the contract to light the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago with alternating current, and by 1895 his company, using Tesla's polyphase AC system, had built the massive hydroelectric generating station at Niagara Falls that effectively settled the technical argument for the next century of electrical infrastructure. Edison's own financial backers, watching DC's market position erode, moved without much sentiment. In 1892, J.P. Morgan orchestrated the merger of Edison General Electric with the rival Thomson Houston Electric Company, and the resulting corporation dropped Edison's name entirely, becoming simply General Electric. Edison, who had built his identity as much as his fortune around being the man whose name appeared on the product, was pushed out of meaningful control of the company that bore the fruit of his signature invention. He reportedly told a reporter afterward that he was done with electric lighting and would find something else worth his time. A characteristic pivot for a man who treated setbacks less as humiliations to absorb than as arguments to walk away from before they could be finished losing. Edison's phonograph, unveiled in 1877, tells a gentler but still complicated version of the same pattern. Real, startling originality, married to a lifelong instinct to control the story of credit. Unlike the light bulb, the phonograph genuinely surprised even people who thought they understood the state of the art, because no one had yet built a working device to record and reproduce sound, though the French inventor Charles Cros had, months earlier, deposited with the French Academy of Sciences a sealed paper describing a similar concept he called the paleophone without ever building a working model. Edison's team constructed a working machine using a stylus, tinfoil, and a rotating cylinder, and Edison himself recited "Mary Had a Little Lamb" into it for the first playback, a moment witnessed by his assistants and widely reported, making it one of the rare instances in his career of an achievement that was both undeniably his and genuinely startling to contemporaries. He then largely abandoned serious development of the phonograph for nearly a decade, chasing other projects, and had to fight his way back into the market against the improved graphophone developed by Alexander Graham Bell's associates and against Emil Berliner's flat disc gramophone, a rivalry Edison approached with his customary conviction that any competing format must be inferior simply because it was not his. Edison's treatment of his own workforce, and later of the emerging film industry, extended the same proprietary instincts into open economic warfare. At his sprawling West Orange laboratory, built in 1887 to be 10 times the size of Menlo Park, Edison employed hundreds of workers under grueling conditions and low wages, expecting round-the-clock loyalty in exchange for association with his name, and several talented subordinates, including William Kennedy, Laurie Dixon, the Scottish-born engineer who did much of the practical development work on Edison's motion picture camera, the kinetograph, left the organization frustrated at how little independent credit or compensation they received for work publicly attributed to Edison alone. When the film industry Edison had helped launch began to slip from his control, he responded not by out-innovating competitors, but by forming the Motion Picture Patents Company in 1908, a trust pooling key film patents to sue independent producers into bankruptcy or submission, a legal siege so aggressive that many early filmmakers relocated across the country to Southern California, specifically to put distance between themselves and Edison's process servers, one of the more direct, if unintended, contributions Edison made to the founding of Hollywood. The most unsettling coda to the War of Currents came in 1903, well after Edison's company had lost the battle for the electrical grid, when Edison Manufacturing Company film crews recorded the electrocution of Topsy, a circus elephant in Coney Island, that had killed several handlers and was slated for destruction. The footage, titled "Electrocuting an Elephant," shows Topsy killed with alternating current, and it circulated as one more entry in a long visual campaign linking AC with death that Edison's organization had been producing directly or indirectly for 15 years. Historians have debated how much personal involvement the 70-year-old Edison had in ordering that particular film, since by 1903 he had largely handed off day-to-day operations at his commercial ventures. But the fact that his company's cameras were there at all, continuing a visual rhetoric he had helped invent, speaks to how long the instinct outlived the original commercial motive. By the time Edison died in 1931, at 84, in his home in West Orange, New Jersey, the public mythology was largely fixed. The self-taught American genius, deaf and poor, who lit the modern world through sheer stubborn brilliance. A story Edison himself had spent 50 years cultivating through calculated interviews, staged demonstrations, and a folksy public persona that concealed a shrewd, sometimes vindictive operator underneath. Lights across the United States were dimmed briefly in his honor at President Herbert Hoover's request, a tribute to the man who had in fact transformed how research itself was organized, turning invention from an individual craft into an industrial process staffed by specialists, a genuine and lasting institutional legacy that later gave rise to corporate research laboratories at General Electric, Bell Labs, and beyond. But that same institutional model depended on a structure in which the men actually doing the chemistry, the mathematics, and the glass-blowing remained anonymous. Their names absent from the patents, while Edison's appeared on nearly all of them, a practice entirely legal under the patent law of the era, which assigned invention to the employer who funded the work, but one that historians of technology, particularly since the opening of the Edison Papers archive at Rutgers in the late 20th century, have increasingly used to separate the documented contributions of Batchelor, Upton, Bohm, Dixon, and dozens of others from the singular legend Edison built. What the record actually supports is neither the storybook wizard nor a cartoon fraud, but something more useful and more uncomfortable. A man of real technical judgment and organizational genius who used that same understanding to make sure the team's work always wore his name. To smear a rival's safer long-term technology as an executioner's weapon when the market threatened his investments, and to treat credit itself as just another resource to be patented, licensed, and defended in court. The tragedy for the historical record is not that Edison lacked talent, it is that his talent for building things was matched, and at times exceeded by his talent for building the story of himself, so thoroughly that even now describing what he actually did requires peeling his own myth away first.